Last week, we started talking about the parable of the Minas in Luke chapter 19. And Jesus gave this parable at a unique time in his ministry. We know that he had just told the disciples that he was going to go to Jerusalem. There he was going to be crucified, that he was going to die, that 3 days later again he was going to rise again. And this news came as a shock to the disciples. And admittedly, it would come as a shock to you, right? I mean, we kind of take this for granted because we have the benefit of 2,000 years of history. But if your good friend comes up to you and says, "Hey, just want you to know, we're going to Mansfield next week, and by the way, I'm going to die there. And by the way, 3 days later, I'm going to rise again." That would kind of come as a shock to you, especially if you know this guy to be a good guy, a smart guy, a leader, someone that you really thought was just going to take the world by the, and lead it into a good place. We find, I don't know about you, but we find that the world is just a screwy place. Don't you? I mean, you just can't look at the news of the day and say, what in the world is going on? I mean, literally, this week, we've got two sides of the world talking about blowing itself up. Is that just the craziest thing ever, or what? We find that we have to arrest people for carrying handguns into dangerous places and shooting people or getting in cars and running someone over. And later on today, we're going to pray a prayer of blessing upon our students. And in that prayer, we're going to pray for safety for them. Well, 10, 15 years ago, we never worried about sending our kids off to school. And now we have to build our schools. And some of you are teachers, you know that. We have to build our schools so that they're like mini fortresses, so that only the right people get in there. What is the world coming to? Well, that's how the disciples felt. This guy that they called their leader, Jesus, they expected that he was going to be crowned king. They kind of expected that the world was going to say, hey, this is the man that we have been waiting for. And he just got done telling them, hey, this world isn't going to work out the way you think it's going to work out. And so I need to tell you a parable that will help you to understand how you live in this world. And so he tells this parable of the Minas. And there's so much deep teaching in this parable. In fact, when I was going through it, I found 10 principles for how we should live in this kingdom of God that is kind of away from the kingdom, what we call exile living. Because literally, we are exiles from the true king. We are citizens of heaven. That's what we just got done singing that we got so excited about, right? But heaven isn't here. This is earth. So how do we live here on planet Earth while we are citizens of heaven, when we are literally here foreigners and exiles in another place? That's what we're talking about. And so Jesus tells this parable of the Minas so that we would understand that. And he says, look, it's like this. There's a guy that is really a wealthy guy who literally is born into royalty, but this place that he's at doesn't recognize it. So he's going to go away, and he's going to go to another place, and he's going to be king. And while he is away, he's going to give every single one of his subjects, he's got 10 servants, he's going to give them a mina. A mina is about 3 or 4 months' worth of wages. And he's going to say, hey, take care of this mina for me, and when I come back, I'm going to ask you to show me what you did with the mina that I gave you. And we learned that, while he's away, that there's this whole world that kind of hates this guy, doesn't want him to be king. In fact, they send a delegation to say, don't king him because we don't want him. But he does come back, and he is king, and he asks for an accounting of these minas. And we learn that one guy took the mina and made it into 10 minas. Another guy took the mina and made it into 5 minas. And one took a mina and did nothing with it but give it back. So last week, we learned the first 4 principles. We learned principle number 1, the principle of sovereignty. Who is our sovereign? What kingdom do we serve? What is our worldview? When we look at this crazy world around us, do we understand that this is a world in exile? Our position as Christ followers is that Christ is our king and we are his subjects. Sometimes we use the word Lord. Now, we don't have lords and ladies anymore, but when we say the word Lord, what we mean is he's our boss. We follow him. We obey him. He has given us commands, and we, as his subjects, decide that we're going to follow his commands, that we're going to do our very best to be obedient to his commands. That's the principle of sovereignty. We learned the principle of stewardship, that we're each given at least one ability, just like each of the servants was given one mina, and that God expects us to use that ability for his kingdom. And we are to be good stewards. That means that we're to be good managers, that we're to take care of what God has entrusted us with. That literally our purpose while we are here in this exiled kingdom is to serve others. And when we do that, we rely on God's strength working through us. We learned last week the principle of loyalty. That not everyone that we're going to come into contact with here on planet Earth is going to understand or agree with us about who God is. They're not going to agree that he should be king. There's, just like in this parable, there's a whole bunch of people that don't want Jesus to be their king. That there are sides and that we have to choose. That there is no question about Jesus' return, that there is coming a day when Jesus is coming back again, but there are sides. And while he is away, we have to choose which side we're going to be on. Do we call him master, and do we live as if he is our master or not? And if we do that while Jesus is away, before he comes back, and we say that he is our master and we are going to live according to his commandments, if the world hates him, guess what? They're going to hate us sometimes too. But the two go hand in hand. So are we loyal in the face of what might be persecution? And then we come to the fourth principle, and that is the principle of accountability. This is a principle where each of the servants are called back to give an account for what they did with their minas. And that in this exile life that we have in this world, that each one of us as Christ followers someday will give an account of ourselves to God too. That's a basic principle of how we live in this life. Now, that's what we learned last week, and there was a lot more detail to it. If you want that, again, I encourage you, churchrequel.org/sermons, and you'll see it right there. Let's get into three more principles today, all right? And here's the first principle, principle 5, actually, in this whole mini sermon series, but the first principle we're going to get into in great detail today is the principle of growth. The principle of growth. We read in Luke 19, verses 16 and 18, the first one came, this is the first servant who's coming back and giving an accounting, all right? The first one came and said, "Sir, your mina has earned 10 more. And then we skip down to verse 18. The second servant came and said, "Sir, your mina has earned 5 more. In other words, these servants had taken the money that was given to them by their master, and they took that and combined it with their ability, and they prospered it. You know, maybe one was a hotelier. Maybe one, bought a hotel and, helped people to stay overnight and take care of them. And as money came in, he kept it separated for his master. Maybe another one was a metal worker, and he opened up a metal shop, and he created metals for people for their usefulness. In other words, they all had different abilities. They all had different ways that they went about it. But here's one thing that they did. They understood that the money that was given to them wasn't their money, right? It was the master's money. And they took their abilities, combined it with the money, the minas that had been given, and they prospered that mina so that when the master came back, they could return a profit. Now, some were more profitable than others. That's okay. But they all had this idea of growth. It all grew. God's creation, in other words, we learn from this, that God's creation is not a zero-sum game. Do you know what I mean by that? We have a world that we live in that for the most part, we look about us and it is what I call a zero-sum game. Anybody who ever watches sports on television understands this, or if you ever go to watch your favorite team play, it's a zero-sum game. It's not a zero-sum game. There is a winner and there is a loser. If somebody else wins, somebody else has to lose. It all has to average out. That is the way the world operates. That's what gambling is all about, by the way. There are gambling houses, and they take your money, and, you try to win, but if you win, that means they have to lose, and they have it set up so that they don't lose all that often. We have another thing like that called the lottery, right? The lottery, every now and then, somebody wins a bunch of money, but there's a whole lot more money that goes into that lottery than what ever gets paid out, right? So we have this kind of philosophy of life sometimes here on planet Earth where we work at a place, and if, we go into a place and we're looking for a job, and there's two people who have the ability to maybe get that job, but there's only one job. There's one person that gets it, and there's another person who doesn't. There is a winner, and there is a loser. That's what this world is like. But that's not what God's kingdom is like. God's kingdom is a kingdom of growth. Everything that he creates grows and produces more. The very first command that God gave to mankind was to go into the earth, multiply it, and fill it. And, with, what is it now? 7 billion people on planet Earth? We're doing that one pretty good. When Jesus here gives his Minas parable, the presumption is growth. The only question is how much. The presumption is growth, but how much? Some 10 times, some 5 times, but all great growth. And this principle of growth is also true of God's kingdom. Jesus tells another parable. We're not going to get into it in great detail now, but we've talked about this before, the parable of the seeds. Jesus says in Luke 8, verse 15, you might remember this from a year ago or so, the seeds that fell on the good soil represent honest, good-hearted people who hear God's word, cling to it, and patiently, what? Produce a large harvest. That's what God's kingdom is like. The Apostle Paul, when he is planting churches, and we read the rest of the New Testament, Paul recognized this growth principle when he's talking about planting these new churches, that all the leaders had a hand in the growth. But who was it that ultimately gave the growth? It wasn't all the leaders, it was God. Take a look at 1 Corinthians 3:6. Paul says, I planted the seed, and Apollo watered it, but here's the key point, God is the one who made it grow. And that brings us to a very important part of this principle that we have to understand. You say, how do I live in this world that is kind of a zero-sum game where there have to be winners and losers all the time? How do I conduct myself in this winner-loser kind of world? How do I make something grow? If I'm expected to take this mina, this ability, and return it back to God, how do I do that? Well, the truth is, you don't. We don't. Because we, by ourselves, don't have the ability to do it. Our very best effort at growth is to win ourselves at somebody else's loss. That's why this world is the way that it is. That's called a zero-sum game. But God specializes in growth. So to become growers, we have to know God. We have to partner with God. We have to allow God to do his thing through us. Again, looking at the Apostle Paul later on in the New Testament, he's writing to a church that he got started in Colossus, called Colossians, chapter 1, verse 10. Here's what he says, then the way you live will always honor and please the Lord, and your lives will produce, get this, your lives will produce every kind of good fruit. That's prosperity, right? That's growth. And all the while, you will grow as you learn to know God better and better. See, even our very lives as Christ followers, you say, I became a Christian, but I don't see this kind of growth in my life. Well, our lives as Christ followers are destined to be stuck at zero-sum gain, at zero growth, without God moving in our heart, moving in our life, having his power through us. If the only time that you ever get connected with God is when you show up here on church on Sunday and you're not into his word, you're not into the Bible throughout the week, you don't have time of prayer, you don't have time of reflection, we're so busy, right? It's so hard just to stop and say, God, what is it that you want me to do today? It's so hard when we're so about what we have to do and what we have to accomplish with our family life and our kids and school and our work and all the things that we've got to do if we're not connecting to God regularly on a daily basis to say, stop! God, what do you want to do in my life? How do you want to grow me? How can I count on you to help grow your kingdom? I want you to grow my abilities. I want you to grow the people that surround me. I want you to grow the resources that you have entrusted to me. All this is good fruit for your kingdom. And I realize that you have given it to me, that it all belongs to you, and that I want to multiply it for you and your kingdom. And I can't do that by myself. I can't do that on my own. And here's the thing. Your enemy, your spiritual enemy, knows this about you. So is it any surprise that he would try to make you as busy as possible so that you can't focus on the most important as possible? The tyranny of the urgent robs us of our God time and robs us of the power of God to operate in our life. So a very important principle, principle 5 that we're talking about here today, that you say, how do I live as a Christ follower? What should my life look like? It should look like growth, because that's what God is. God is a God of growth. And if I'm in God and God is in me, my life is going to grow. The people around me are going to grow. My church is going to grow. My family is going to grow. My job is going to grow. My responsibilities are going to grow. My reliance upon God is going to grow. My knowledge of God is going to grow. And if I look back at the last 10 years and I say, boy, there's just not much growth in my life, then we got to question whether or not we are really living according to the principle of God as a Christ follower, or whether we're living in the principle of the world, just a zero-sum game. So that makes sense to you? Let's move on. Principle number 6 that we learn in this parable of the Minas is I love this. This is the principle of reward. The principle of reward. This is an important principle of living this Christian life here and now, that we are literally working for and expecting rewards later. Isn't that selfish? God created in you the ability to look forward to rewards. And here's how I know this. Take a look at verses 17 and 19. Now again, this is about the master in this parable who returns. And what is it that he says? Verse 17. Well done, my good servant, his master replied. Because you have been trustworthy in a very small matter, take charge of 10 cities. Or skip down to verse 19. This is the second servant. His master answered to the second one, you take charge of 5 cities. Now let me share with you 3 obvious, but maybe not so obvious points about rewards and God's rewards. Here's principle number 1, or I should say point number 1 in this principle about reward. The rewards are completely out of proportion to the growth that we have actually experienced. All right, so each one of these guys gets a mina, which we know to be about 3 to 4 months worth of income. So this first one takes that 3 to 4 months worth of wages and turns it into 10 times that amount, which would be maybe what, 40 months' worth of wages, so he actually returns about 3.5 years' worth of his wages. And what's the reward that he gets? He returns 3.5 years' worth of wages at his level, and what does the master give to him as his reward? Do you see it? 10 cities. I don't care how poor the city is. 10 cities is a whole lot more than 3.5 years worth of wages, right? Here's the second idea of rewards. This reward of 10 cities is more likely the management of 10 cities. In other words, he's overseeing, he's like the mayor of these 10 cities. He's like the county commissioner of the county that has 10 cities in it. In other words, the one who is faithful with a little mina can be counted on and can be entrusted with even more. This is the issue of the master's trust, of earning the trust of your master. That the master comes back and brings us back to this concept of stewardship that we talked about last week, that everything that we have belongs to him, including my body, including my work, including my abilities, including my assets, including my family, and that I am entrusting it all to God to work through me so that I might be able to be faithful in how I handle what he's given me. And that God is looking at our faithfulness while we are here as exiles to say, look, that guy, he took what I gave him and he not only gave it back to me, but he gave me more growth. That's the guy that I can count on. And so when he gets to the real kingdom, I'm going to just give him a whole bunch of stuff to do, because if he can handle the little thing, guess what? I know he can handle the big thing. Rewards are all out of proportion to what the growth is. And here's the third thing that I think that we struggle the most with. But if you can leave here today and you get this, it's going to change your life. And that's this about rewards, that you and I should be motivated by the prospect of these rewards someday. When Paul is writing again to his church at Colossus, in Colossians 3:23 and 24, he says this: whatever you do, do it wholeheartedly as though you were working for your real master and not merely for humans. You know your real master will give you an inheritance as your reward. Let me read that back to you. You know that your real master will give you an inheritance as your reward. At this point, you guys should be underlining this and putting a star next to it in your Bible or on your program. You know that your real master will someday give you an inheritance as your reward. And who is that master? He is Christ, your real master whom you are serving. Some of you may have the wrong idea of this, thinking that you shouldn't be motivated by rewards. That means I'm greedy. That the things I'm doing here on earth are just so that I get more in heaven someday, and that just kind of has this dirty tint to it. Like somehow it's selfish. Like somehow it's unchristian. How can it be unchristian when Christ is the one who said it? Not at all. You want to serve your master here on earth as well as you can. Why? So that you can serve him even more in heaven someday. So that you can be found faithful, trustworthy, and loyal. And you should want that. You should say, my time here on earth is not just to get from here to here. I'm not just rushing from the crib to the grave and trying to get all I can for myself in between. No, what I want to do is I want to be faithful. I want to take care of the things that he's given me, because there's all of eternity to look forward to. And I want my master to know I'm a guy who can be counted on. I want to be rewarded for that. I want to live in heaven someday as a guy that can be counted on, as a girl that can be counted on. That this little 70 years or so that we had here on planet Earth wasn't about the 70 years, that it's about all of eternity. That's why the direction that you are on right now, that direction of growth that we talked about before, is so important. Because if you're growing now, if you take that direction and you apply that over an eternity, what's eternity going to be like for you? But if your direction is or boy, that's not a great eternity to look forward to, right? So we want to be counted on. But I want you to know something. This is not as easy as it sounds. That leads us to principle number 7, and we'll wrap it up here this week. I hope this gives you the courage to come back next week. But that is our principle number 7, that to do this, what I'm talking to you about today, takes courage. It takes courage. Because we come to the third servant who failed to grow. Verses 20 and 21 in Luke 19. Then another servant came and said, "Sir, here is your mina." Hey, at least he kept it. He didn't spend it on himself, right? He kept it to give it back. Hey, sir, master, here is your mina. I have kept it laid away in a piece of cloth. But here's the key to this. I was afraid of you, because you are a hard man. You take out what you did not put in and reap what you did not sow. I want you to underline, I was afraid. You see, fear of failure, which we all have, fear of failure can keep us stuck at 0. If you're not seeing growth in your life, it may be because you're afraid. And if you're afraid, it shows that you just don't understand our Master, that you don't understand our Lord. Because the greater failure is not trying. The greater failure is not trusting. Because if I trust God to give me the growth enough that I'm going to try doing what it is that I believe God has created me to do, and I believe that God is the God of growth, and I'm trusting Him, and I am trying. If I understand the growth is up to God, not up to me, that I have to trust Him to translate my efforts at growth into growth for His kingdom, to become real growth, not the zero-sum gain of winners and losers. I have to be able to say, look, I'm willing to get out of the rut that I'm in. I'm willing to go beyond my comfort level. I'm willing to take some steps of faith, trusting in God to work through me to do what it is that He wants to do. So we can be fearful. Taking that step you can be afraid. You can be afraid that you're going to fail. Don't be. Be more fearful that you're not going to grow. Be more fearful that you're not going to trust. Be more fearful that you're not going to try. Now, for some of us, it also may be that we're afraid of the people around us. We may be in a tough situation. We may be surrounded by people who don't believe in us. We may be surrounded by people who put us down. We may be surrounded by people who see us in a certain way and just kind of box us in. And you're ready to break out. But they only know your past. They only know your failures. They only know your zero-sum gain life without God's power in your life. They haven't seen the real you yet. Don't be afraid of the people around us. Trust the Lord that He is the answer. Proverbs 29:25 says, being afraid of people can get you into trouble. But if you trust the Lord, you will be safe. Bottom line, and I give this with you so that you can take this home with you this week. Living in exile, living here on planet Earth in exile, away from our citizenship in heaven, living as a Christ follower is not easy. It actually is going to take effort, and that's what we're going to talk about next week. When you come back here, I can't wait to share this last sermon with you, because it takes effort and it takes courage. And like growth, the courage that we need doesn't come from ourselves. Even that courage comes from God. If you find yourself being afraid of the people around you, that you're boxed in, you find yourself being afraid of failure yourself, pray to God. God, I am fearful, and I know that I'm not supposed to be. I know that's not of you. I know that's me or the hurtful words that other people around me are saying and plugging into my life, but I know that doesn't come from you. What do we read in 2 Timothy 1:7? God does not give us a cowardly spirit, but he gives us a spirit of power, a spirit of love, a spirit of good judgment. Do you begin to see here why it's so vital to you that you stay close to God in your life as Christ followers? That he has the growth, that he has the power, that he has the love, that he has the good judgment, that you need to be able to live a non-fearful, not cowardly, powerful life to be able to accomplish the things that God has created for you to accomplish for him. And that when you receive Jesus in your life, you are literally receiving his Spirit in you to power you forward. That God doesn't say, okay, you're saved, boom, that's it. If that was the case, we'd just be all zapped up to heaven right now. No, he leaves us here because we are his representatives. We are his power. We are his good judgment to make a difference in this exile world while we are here. So how can we avail ourselves of those things, that power from God, if we're not connected to him? You have to be connected in God's word and in his prayer. And if we stop following, you're going to find yourself being sapped of your courage. Our strength and our courage always come from God. One last verse, and then we'll wrap it up here. Joshua 1:9, going way back to the beginning of the scriptures. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened, and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Now let me put this together. We've had 2 weeks. Let me put this together for you so that this begins to shape and make sense to you. All the things that we learned last week, that we opened up with today as a reminder, the issue of sovereignty, that God is our sovereign, the issue of stewardship, that everything he's given us belongs to him and that we use for him, and that loyalty is using our good gifts for building his kingdom. All that provides the power for what we learned this week. That God is sovereign, using what we have as good managers, good stewards for him, and doing all of that in a loyal way. That is the power that helps us to grow, that helps us to be reminded of the reward that he has for us someday, and to have the courage to be able to do it. It's like fuel for the fire. That's where accountability comes in. You say, well, how do I put this together? How do I think in terms of the sovereignty of God in my life and the stewardship of handling everything he's given to me and being loyal to him? How do I connect that to this idea of growth and reward and courage to do it? Just put an equal sign. If you start your life, if you start your day, if you start your thinking, if the mentality of when you see this world that's around you all messed up, we all see it, and it bothers each one of us. But we say, you know what, God? This isn't your kingdom. And you are king, and I am loyal to you. And whatever it is that you've given to me, I'm going to use for you. That is what will translate in your life to give you the courage to grow so that someday you might have rewards in heaven. But we have to have utter dependence upon God. Do you want that for yourself? Do you want that for your life? Do you want to be like those first 2 servants that when the master comes back, say, look, here's what I had. I took what you gave me, and I turned it into even more for you. I don't know about you, but I want to hear from my master, from your master someday, well done, good and faithful servant. I have even more for you to do now. you.